The cold reality of that morning still tastes like ash in my mouth. It was the morning I nearly abandoned 80 years of family history for a signature, and a check that wouldn't clear the spiritual debt. I was standing in the center of the studio, my fortress of thread and silk with the realtor's pen hovering in my hand, ready to concede, ready to let the greed of my own blood claim the only truly honest thing I had ever built. My name is Evelyn. You know my story, or you think you do. But what they don't tell you about matriarchs is that their greatest strength is often their deepest vulnerability. For decades, this studio, the Golden Needle, was my sanctuary. It was the whisper of my mother's wisdom, the quiet hum of my own dedication. But that morning, it felt like a cage. Shrinking under the pressure of my son Malachi's insistent phone calls and my daughter-in-law Zola's sickeningly sweet emails. They didn't see history or artistry. They saw acreage, zoning codes, and a fat commission waiting to be split. Theodora, that was the name I was born with, before the world decided I needed a sharper edge. An armor strong enough to withstand both the economic downturn and the betrayal of the next generation. But on that Thursday, Theodora was back, hesitant and worn down. Looking at the worn floorboards that had caught countless pins and tears, it wasn't the cost of the property tax that was breaking me. It was the cost of the fight. The cost of standing alone against two people who knew exactly which buttons to press: guilt, age, and fear of being left behind. They positioned the sale as an act of love, a means to ensure my comfort in my golden years. They spoke of the burden this ancient building placed on my health, the time it stole from my supposed leisure. Leisure. What is leisure to a craftsman whose hands have never known true rest? It was a calculated, subtle form of psychological warfare, slowly eroding the foundation of my will. Malachi, my own son, my flesh and blood, had perfected the language of passive aggression, always delivering his veiled threats with a polite, concerned frown. But why this sudden, intense focus on this single building? It wasn't just the prime location, though, that was a significant factor in their hurried acquisition plans. No, the Golden Needle was a target because of what they believed I held within it. They knew, in some cold, transactional part of their minds, that the true value of this studio was not its brick and mortar, but the legacy it housed. And in the corner, shrouded beneath a protective cloth, was the one thing that connected my past to their treacherous future, the only tangible evidence of the shadow stitch. Technique. They were not just trying to buy a building. They were trying to decommission a monument. The Golden Needle was not built on speculation. It was built on patience. Every bolt of linen, every spool of thread, every meticulously categorized drawer held a memory of a time when craftsmanship was not a hobby, but a sacred covenant between the artist and the material. My mentor, the late Langston Dubois, had always told me, "Theodora, you don't just mend clothes. You mend time." I felt that deeply, especially now, as the clock on my studio wall seemed to be ticking toward an unwelcome terminal hour. The strategy of Malachi and Zola was insidious precisely because it was dressed in genuine, if misplaced concern. They never yelled. They never threatened. Instead, they relied on statistics and spreadsheets. Zola, with her degree in business management and her polished veneer of modern efficiency, would send me monthly reports highlighting the studio's underperformance against current real estate potential. "Mom," she'd say, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness over the phone, "you could be sitting on a 7-figure retirement fund instead of breathing in dust and decades." Dust and decades. That was her definition of history and legacy. Malachi, meanwhile, focused on the immediate physical decay of the building itself. He'd point out the creeping ivy on the north wall, the outdated electrical system, the impossibility of obtaining proper historical building insurance. Every visit was a calculated inspection tour, designed not to help fix the problems, but to magnify them in my mind, making the building feel less like a fortress and more like a crumbling responsibility I was too frail to bear. What they failed to understand was that the studio's imperfections were its strength. The slightly warped floorboards were a testament to the thousands of steps I'd taken, The scent of aged fabric and oil was the perfume of dedication. By trying to convince me it was a burden. They were trying to convince me that my life's work, my very self-definition, was a liability. The pressure was not just to sell the asset. It was to retire the identity. I knew what they were planning. Once the studio was sold, I would be moved to one of their pre-selected, sterile retirement communities, a place where quiet reflection was traded for scheduled activities, and where I would be permanently removed from any control over my own life or, crucially, my remaining valuable artifacts. I was to be filed away, the past neatly liquidated. But just as the pen was hovering over the contract's signature line, a sudden, sharp, almost violent rap came at the studio door, a disruption so jarring it felt like fate itself intervening. The knocking was not the polite tap of a customer, nor the firm, expected rhythm of the realtor waiting impatiently outside my view. It was frantic, desperate, and young. It was the sound of urgency and distress slicing through the calculated stillness of my impending surrender. I dropped the pen. It clattered against the old mahogany desk, the sound echoing the sudden shift in my emotional landscape. This abrupt interruption did more than just delay the signing. It offered me a moment of clarity. For weeks, Malachi and Zola had monopolized my reality, filling the space with their voices and their spreadsheets. This sound, this raw plea for help, was the first genuine, unmediated contact I'd had with the outside world in what felt like months. It was a lifeline thrown from the shore, just as I was drifting into the sea of their demands. The young woman who stood on my threshold was named Amara. Her eyes were wide, panicked and red-rimmed, and she carried a large, carefully wrapped bundle that she held as if it were a wounded child. She didn't bother with pleasantries. Her immediate, breathless words were a torrent of despair. "You are Theodora, aren't you? The seamstress. I heard you were the only one left who could do this. Please, you have to help me. By morning, by morning." The deadline was absurd, an impossible demand placed upon a woman they believed was ready to retire her tools forever. But Amara's desperation was infectious. It wasn't the desperate pleading of someone who had lost a small sum of money. It was the raw, immediate terror of someone whose legacy was being threatened. I stepped back, allowing her into the studio, and my eyes immediately went to the bundle. Amara carefully unwrapped it, revealing a cascade of aged ivory silk wedding dress. It was magnificent, antique, and catastrophically damaged. The tear was not a simple tear. It was a violent rending, exposing the delicate understructure. It was a damage that spoke less of accident and more of carelessness, or perhaps deliberate destruction. As I took the dress from her, the sheer tactile sensation of the fabric, cool, heavy, and whisper thing, jolted me. It was the physical shock of fine art, reminding my hands of the precise, demanding work they were made for. For the first time in months, I didn't feel old, burdened, or weak. I felt required. Required by the craft, required by the urgency, required by a piece of history that demanded respect. The realtor's contract lay forgotten on the desk. The true emergency had just walked through the door. The wedding dress was more than just a garment. It was a museum piece, meticulously preserved, likely dating back to the late 19th century. Its damage was a tragedy. But the challenge it presented was a thrilling counter-argument to every word Malachi and Zola had used to chip away at my resolve. They had said I was too old for responsibility. This dress was the ultimate responsibility. I spread the antique silk out across my largest cutting table, chasing away the dust motes with a wave of my hand. The tear was jagged, running the length of the bodice. A repair of this magnitude required not just skill, but an understanding of the textile itself, its tension, and its original construction. It needed the shadow stitch, the legendary technique only Langston Dubois had mastered, and which he had painstakingly taught only to me. A technique that left no seam, no thread visible, allowing the mended piece to appear seamless, untouched by time or damage. Amara explained the urgency. The dress was scheduled to be the centerpiece of a university exhibition on historical textiles, opening at 9 a.m. the next morning. The exhibition was crucial to her academic career. The damage had occurred hours ago during transit, a moment of profound, career-threatening carelessness. She didn't just need a repair. She needed a miracle of invisible mending. The pressure was immense, yet it was a pressure I thrived and clean. Honest professional pressure untainted by familial manipulation. My eyes met Amara's, and I saw a reflection of my younger self, passionate, driven, and desperate to preserve something beautiful and meaningful against the forces of accident and apathy. It was clear she valued the history and the art far above any insurance payout. Her integrity was the match that lit my dormant fire. I looked back at the desk where the real estate contract lay. The signature line seemed ludicrous now. How could I sign away my entire life's purpose, my singular ability, for a mere sum of money, when the fate of this beautiful historical artifact hung in the balance? The irony was profound. Malachi and Zola were trying to liquidate my past, and here was the past itself, demanding that I take up my tools once more. I agreed to the repair without even pausing to discuss the fee. My fee would be the work itself, the reclaiming of my identity. Amara wept with relief, offering me a down payment that I barely registered. My focus was already internal, already tracing the complex, nearly impossible path of the shadow stitch across the damaged fabric. The decision had been made. The golden needle was not selling today. It had a job to do. The studio transformed instantly from a place of resignation to a war room of artistic endeavor. I pulled out my special toolkit, the box given to me by Langston decades ago, containing needles thinner than human hair and spools of threads so fine they appeared to be woven light. These were not tools for hobbyists. They were instruments of preservation, reserved only for challenges that demanded the utmost silence and precision. The first few hours were spent in analysis. I didn't touch the tier immediately. Instead, I studied the weave under magnification, tracing the original direction of every silk fiber. The shadow stitch wasn't just about making the mending invisible. It was about understanding the fabric's history, how it settled, how it aged, how it breathed. It required me to become a part of the garment's original creation process. This deep dive into my work instantly cleansed the space of the poison Malachi and Zola had introduced. The sound of their voices, the droning insistence on sales and retirement, was replaced by the focused silence of my own breathing and the faint, rhythmic sound of the antique clock. I was Theodora again, the master craftswoman, accountable only to the integrity of the fabric in my hands. But as my focus sharpened, a new, unsettling thought began to crystallize. Why had Malachi and Zola been so aggressively persistent this month? They had pushed before, yes, but never with this level of calculated, relentless pressure. It was almost as if they were racing against an unseen deadline or had acquired a sudden, urgent need for cash that went beyond their usual greed. I paused my work, the magnifying glass suspended over the damaged bodice, and reached for my old leather-bound client's ledger. I flipped through the pages, noting past commissions, payments, and, most importantly, the names. And they're buried deep in a 3-year-old entry, a small, seemingly innocuous mention of a consulting fee paid by Zola's University Alumni Foundation. The amount was small, yet the connection felt too deliberate to be a coincidence. Zola had maintained a careful distance from my studio for years, always treating my work as a quaint, embarrassing relic. Why was her Alumni Foundation making payments related to historical textiles 3 years ago? A chilling hypothesis began to form. Their current push to acquire the studio wasn't just about the land. It was about ensuring I had no control and no evidence of a deeper plot that was already years in the making. The dress was not an interruption. It was the key to unlocking their entire scheme. The realization hit with the force of a sudden, deep cold. The university exhibition, the same one the antique wedding dress was destined for, was not just some arbitrary event. It was likely the culmination of Zola's years-long maneuvering. She wasn't merely hoping to sell the land. She was setting up a dramatic, high-profile theft of intellectual and historical property. And my studio was the final obstacle. I continued the repair work, But the focused calm was now layered with an intense, calculated fury. My needlework became sharper, fueled by the adrenaline of a woman who understands she is fighting not just for her home, but for her reputation and the integrity of a dying art form. Every stitch was an act of defiance, a silent promise that I would not let them win. I began to work on two fronts. 1. The physical repair of the dress, which demanded every ounce of my skill and patience. 2. The subtle gathering of my own defenses. I retrieved my old voice recorder, a discreet device I'd originally purchased years ago for dictating design notes, and placed it strategically near my desk, ensuring that any further aggressive calls or surprise visits from Malachi and Zola would be documented. I was done being the passive victim. I was now the deliberate architect of my own defense, as I carefully drew the silk fibers together. The history of the shadow stitch flooded my mind. Langston had designed it for invisibility, yes, but also for resilience. It was meant to hold firm for centuries. It required a unique thread, made from a blend of rare silk and a nearly invisible synthetic chora secret only I possessed. If Malachi and Zola intended to exploit the finished dress, they would need to prove its authenticity. And without knowing the secret components of the mending, any attempt to copy or replicate the technique would inevitably fail under expert scrutiny. This small, technical detail, the very nature of the thread, became my protective shield. They could steal the dress, but they could not steal the secret that validated the work. I had the power to expose any lie they tried to tell about its restoration. My focus returned to Amara's request by morning. I had accepted the deadline, and now it was personal. The completion of the dress was no longer just a professional obligation. It was the essential first step in my counterattack. The success of the exhibition, the public unveiling of the perfectly restored antique, would be the very trigger that forced Malachi and Zola's hand, exposing their urgency and their hidden agenda. The studio was a target because inside its dusty walls, the truth about the $50 million legacy was quietly being stitched back together. The silence stretched into the early hours of the morning, broken only by the delicate click of my smallest shears and the relentless hum of the antique refrigerator. The final stages of the shadow stitch were always the most demanding, the merging of the new work with the old, the final, nearly spiritual integration that made the repair disappear entirely. My hands moved with the muscle memory of decades, guided by a focus so intense it felt like the world outside the studio had ceased to exist as the sun began to rise, casting long, dusty beams across the studio floor. The work was complete. I stepped back, adjusting my glasses. The antique wedding dress lay flawless on the table. The violent tear was gone, the silk restored to its original unbroken beauty. It wasn't just mended, it was resurrected. And seeing that perfection, I knew with absolute certainty that I would not be signing that contract today or ever. I took the real estate contract from the desk. It felt flimsy, irrelevant, a piece of cheap paper compared to the integrity of the dress lying beside it. The realtor would arrive soon, followed by Malachi and Zola, expecting my surrender. But they would not find a retiring old woman. They would find Evelyn, the matriarch, standing firm on the ground of her legacy. I quietly placed the voice recorder in my pocket, ensuring it was set to record. The studio was their target because they believed I was disposable, that my art was worthless, and that the only remaining value was the land beneath the floor. They planned to eliminate the history to profit from the future. But the history had just fought back. The repair of the dress had been my emotional awakening, reminding me of the one thing Malachi and Zola had forgotten. I still possessed a power they desperately needed, and which they grossly underestimated. The dress was now authenticated by the shadow stitch, ready for its public display, ready to act as the bait in my trap. The next few hours would require me to feign compliance, to act the part of the weary mother while secretly preparing for the confrontation. The battle for the studio was over, but the war for my legacy and the exposure of my family's deceit was just beginning. I took a deep breath, the scent of fresh silk and old wood filling my lungs. I was ready, the sunlight pouring through the studio window, which had earlier revealed the flawless repair of the antique dress, now served only to illuminate the contrast between the beauty of my craft and the ugliness of the impending conversation. Malachi and Zola arrived precisely at the designated time, their punctuality a weapon in their arsenal of polite coercion. They walked into the Golden Needle not as family come to visit, but as auditors come to close a bankrupt operation. The emotional hook was immediate and visceral. When my son, my own flesh and blood, first looked at the studio, his expression wasn't one of nostalgia or appreciation. It was a calculated Saya performance of weary, forced sympathy that cut deeper than any insult. He didn't see the perfect restoration lying carefully draped on the table. He only saw the dust motes dancing in the light, the exposed wiring he had repeatedly flagged, and the financial liability of the whole structure. Malachi began, his voice lowered to that infuriating pitch of patronizing concern. The realtor called. He said, "You delayed the signing. We need to talk about this burden you're placing on yourself." The word burden. It was the anchor they repeatedly threw to sink my resolve. They used it to describe the building, the tools, the decades of dedication, and, implicitly, my very existence as an independent woman. It was a linguistic dismissal, a refusal to acknowledge that the creative effort they scorned was the very pulse of my existence. A financial burden? Yes, perhaps to a distant banker, but never an emotional one to me. I looked at Malachi. He was wearing an expensive, tailored suit. I could have sewn myself with greater precision. But one purchased, no doubt with the funds they constantly worried I wasn't accumulating fast enough. He carried the air of modern, fast-paced success, which regarded anything slow, anything meticulous, anything old, as inherently inefficient and therefore disposable. Zola, standing slightly behind him, played her role as the quiet, nodding accomplice, the human reinforcement to his financial argument. She offered a brief, tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her calculating eyes. They were a perfectly calibrated team. Malachi, the blunt instrument of familial obligation. Zola, the architect of the financial and professional conspiracy. "Malachi," I replied, my voice steady, deliberately slow, and devoid of the fatigue they expected. "The studio is not a burden. The demands being placed on me are the burden." The subtle shift in my tone, the uncharacteristic firmness, caused a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He had expected tears, guilt, or at least exhaustion. He received calm, focused resistance instead. The game had just changed. And neither of them had noticed the new rules. The confusion on Malachi's face quickly morphed into professional annoyance. When the matriarch deviated from the script of expected frailty, it was simply an inconvenience, a delay in finalizing the paperwork that would release my financial holdings into their sphere of influence. He pulled out a printed sheet, folded neatly in his jacket pocket, and adopted the tone he used for correcting junior staff. "Mom, look at these figures," he insisted, smoothing the paper on my cutting table, the very table that held a masterpiece of textile preservation. "The market valuation of this property has increased 30% in the last quarter alone. Every day we hold on to this, it's a 6-figure risk. We've talked to the assisted living people. They have a beautiful unit ready for you. Everything will be taken care of. You can relax." "Relax," I echoed, the word tasting bitter. He offered me a sterile prison dressed up as luxury, trading my independence for a routine dictated by a nurse's schedule. He didn't understand the intrinsic value of having to work, of having a skill so rare and so essential that the world occasionally demanded the impossible from your hands. To Malachi, work was a means to an end. To me, it was the definition of the self. I let my gaze sweep slowly over the tools of my trade. The massive cast-iron sewing machine that still ran on foot power for the most delicate seams. The light box used for studying the finest weaves. The jars of centuries-old dyes. To him, they were clutter. To me, they were a living history, a direct tangible connection to the lineage of true artisans. This studio, I began, letting the gravity of the name settle in the room, has provided for this family for 3 generations. It funded your education, Malachi. It paid for the wedding that Zola still brags about. You see risk. I see the most stable thing in our lineage. And the idea that I should simply relax implies that the life I have built, a life of creation and mastery, is disposable. Zola finally spoke, her voice light, attempting to interject a feminine, soothing touch to the argument. But Theodora, dear, we just worry about you climbing those stairs. We worry about you being alone here. Think of the freedom. You could take up painting or travel. Something new. I knew what new meant to them. It meant distraction. It meant displacement. It meant removing the inconvenient matriarch from the scene of the crime before the grand heist could take place. Their concern was not for my safety, but for the security of their scheme, which relied entirely on my silence and my absence. The core of their dismissal was their inability to assign value to anything that wasn't immediately convertible to cash. They couldn't monetize dedication. They certainly couldn't put a price tag on the unique knowledge sealed behind the shadow stitch. Therefore, in their modern transactional minds, my entire professional life was reduced to a sentiment and nostalgic attachment to a drafty old building. I decided to give them a brief, cold history lesson. When your grandfather built this studio, Malachi, he built it not for profit, but for permanence. He believed that quality and skill outlast market bubbles. The wood of this counter alone is older than the entire lifespan of your brokerage firm. I paused, letting the silence emphasize the gap between my measured time and their fleeting investments. Malachi shifted uncomfortably. Direct challenges to his professional worldview always irritated him. He preferred the emotional argument, the one where I was cast as the stubborn, slightly senile parent resisting help. We respect the history. Mom, of course we do. Zola quickly intervened, her voice speeding up, anxious to move past the inconvenient truth. But history is lovely. Security is necessary. We just need you to see the opportunity, Hera. Fresh start. Opportunity, I repeated. The word sounded hollow and dishonest in her mouth. I watched her eyes drift, not toward the contract, but toward the corner where the carefully folded antique dress lay hidden beneath its protective cloth. The movement was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but to my newly sharpened focus, it was a profound confession. She was checking on the asset my realization from the previous night solidified. The sale of the studio was not the primary goal. It was the containment mechanism. They needed me out, silenced and unable to intervene when they decided to unveil the restored dress, a masterpiece. I had just perfected as their own discovery, or, worse, a piece of inherited, undervalued inventory that they were selling for massive profit. Their dismissiveness wasn't merely condescending. It was calculated. They needed me to believe my life's work was a worthless burden so that I wouldn't question the sudden, immense value they were about to extract from one single item within it. The cruelty was surgical. They were dismissing me in order to elevate the one thing they wanted to steal. I felt a surge of cold, focused determination. My response had to be calm, authoritative, and perfectly timed to disrupt their expectations without revealing my hand. The battle would not be won by anger, but by precision. I decided to test the limits of their professional facade. I gestured toward the desk where the contract remained unsigned. You talk about efficiency, Malachi. Let's discuss efficiency. I don't have all day, Mom. We have a closing scheduled for the property transfer later this afternoon, provided you sign now. His impatience was a clear tell. He was already spending the commission. I fixed my gaze on him, allowing my expression to harden into the stern matriarch they rarely saw. You are rushing, and rushing is the enemy of profit. Tell me, if this studio is such a burden, why did you spend 3 years subtly asking me about the inventory? Why did Zola keep probing about Langston Dubois's former clients? You are not worried about my health. You are worried about access. The shift in the room was immediate. Zola's smile vanished completely, replaced by a momentary, panicked tightening around her eyes. Malachi, ever the businessman, tried to recover instantly, using denial as his shield. "That's absurd, Mom. We were simply curious about family history. Stop confusing your sentimentality with conspiracy." He dismissed my observation with a quick, chopping hand gesture of physical denial that failed to hide the sudden tension in his shoulders. I was close to the truth. The key to their plan was the dress, and the key to the dress was the shadow stitch. They needed the studio gone before the dress was officially exhibited, and its value. Publicly revealed value that would trace back to me and my unique skill, thereby complicating their claim. I leaned slightly forward, resting my hands on the cool wood of the table. "You see this building as merely square footage. I see it as the vault that holds 2 generations of intellectual property. And I am telling you directly, it's not a burden, Malachi, it's my life." That simple statement, the quiet assertion of my sovereignty, was the most devastating blow I could land. It stripped away all their carefully constructed financial arguments and replaced them with a raw, emotional confrontation they were unprepared for. They could argue about market rates. They could not argue about my right to exist. Zola tried a new tactic. The carefully rehearsed plea of the loving daughter-in-law, "Theodora, please. We just want to see you happy and comfortable. We want to protect you from the physical toll of this work." She even reached out a hand, intending to touch my arm. I pulled back instantly, subtly. Maintaining the physical distance that mirrored the emotional chasm between us, the matriarch's refusal to be touched was a clear signal that the time for pretense was over. Malachi's control slipped further. He moved from patronizing concern to thinly veiled anger, the true nature of his intent beginning to bleed through his tailored facade. "Look, Mom," he said, his voice now carrying a hard edge of frustration. "We are trying to avoid a legal conflict here. We have legal advice that states you are mentally incapable of managing a property of this size and complexity, a legal conflict." I cut him off, my voice remaining calm, the deliberate slowness only amplifying the power of my interruption. Did the same legal advisor suggest that a simple handwritten amendment to my will, stating that the studio and its contents are to be donated to the Langston Dubois Foundation, would entirely derail your acquisition plans? The effect was instantaneous and profound. Malachi froze mid-sentence, his face going pale. Zola gasped, a small involuntary sound of pure panic. I had hit the nerve center of their conspiracy. Their entire plan hinged on my passivity and the assumption that my only alternative was selling the property to them. They had never considered the nuclear option, turning the studio into a protected historical endowment, placing it permanently outside their reach. The threat of the foundation was not an empty one. Langston Dubois had mentored me for nearly 20 years. His foundation had always maintained an interest in my studio, knowing it held the last remaining documents and tools relating to his most esoteric techniques, including the shadow stitch. By threatening the donation, I was threatening to make the building unmonetizable for them forever. The irony was delicious. They wanted to use the studio's contents, the shadow stitch, on the antique dress to gain high society financial traction. But I was using the legacy of the studio itself to block their attempt. Zola immediately scrambled, switching back to the overly solicitous tone. "Theodora, that's so extreme. Why would you punish us like that? We only want what's best." "I am not punishing you, Zola," I stated flatly. "I am teaching you a lesson in value. You measure life by profit margins. I measure it by integrity. The moment you chose to manipulate my health and my independence for profit, you chose to forfeit your claim to my generosity." My composure unsettled them deeply. They needed me to be hysterical, to be easily dismissed. My clarity, my knowledge of their legal vulnerability, and my quiet mention of the foundation exposed their control as an illusion. The power had shifted back across the table, firmly into my hands. Al-Malachi regained his composure. But the underlying panic was still visible in the sharp, unnatural speed of his blinking. He attempted to pivot the conversation back to the immediate, non-threatening reality, the physical inconvenience of the property. Let's be reasonable, Mom. This isn't about the foundation. This is about the maintenance. The roof needs a 6-figure repair. You can't handle that. He tried to sound empathetic, but his voice was strained. I allowed a slow, deliberate smile to cross my face. This was where I would allow them a small, controlled victory, a deceptive concession that would make them confident enough to expose the next phase of their plan. The roof, I conceded, nodding slightly. Yes, it's true. The expenses are getting complicated. And perhaps I have been tired. I have spent the entire night working on a difficult piece. I am indeed very tired. My admission of exhaustion was a carefully constructed lie designed to soothe their anxiety. They immediately seized upon it, reading it as the weariness of a woman ready to collapse. They overlooked the crucial detail, the difficult piece I had just finished. That's all we needed to hear, Mom, Malachi said, relief flooding his expression. See, just admit you need help. We can delay the realtor for a few days if you let us handle the inventory assessment first. We need to know what's in here for insurance purposes before you move out, just in case of any accidents. The inventory assessment. This was the true immediate goal. They weren't just worried about a future sale. They were desperate to get their hands on the contents of the studio, specifically the antique dress, before it left the premises. The dress was likely the central piece of Zola's art world. Manipulation, a lost or unknown piece that she intended to present as her own discovery, or perhaps even claim partial ownership of, through some fabricated paperwork. An inventory assessment, I mused aloud, leaning back. That sounds sensible. But it's an overwhelming task for an old woman. I would need to be present to identify the materials, the vintage thread, the artifacts. And frankly, after an all-night work session, I need a nap. Zola stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with anticipation, the sight of victory now within reach. Oh, we can handle it, Theodora. We'll start with the main cutting area. We won't disturb you. Just point us toward the most valuable items so we can prioritize the assessment, and you can rest. The eagerness in her voice was almost indecent. She was reaching for the bait. I allowed my gaze to drift toward the corner of the room, exactly where the restored antique dress lay carefully covered. I kept my voice deliberately soft, playing the role of the trusting, weary mother. Well, I sighed. If you're going to assess value, you should start with the piece I just finished. It's under that cloth. It's the most complex repair I've done in years. It required the shadow stitch, a very rare technique. I wouldn't want you to overlook that for insurance purposes. I made sure to emphasize the technical term, shadow stitch. It was a term that Malachi, with his focus on stocks, wouldn't understand, but I suspected Zola, with her connections to the art and textile world, would recognize instantly. The effect on her was profound. Her eyes widened slightly, and a flicker of pure, unadulterated triumph passed across her face. Triumph that was immediately and poorly hidden. Wonderful, dear, Zola cooed, her hands already reaching for the protective cloth. We will definitely prioritize anything involving the shadow stitch. You go rest. We've got this handled. I think they do. I offered a weak, tired smile, the perfect mask for the cold intelligence currently calculating their every move. I watched them circle the cutting table, their greed radiating from them like a sour heat. They had walked into my studio intending to liquidate my existence, and they had instead stumbled directly into the first phase of my counter-operation. By admitting exhaustion and pointing them toward the dress, I was not surrendering. I was giving them the precise, damning evidence they needed to secure their own downfall. As I slowly made my way toward the small back room, feigning physical weariness, I felt the comforting, hard presence of the activated voice recorder in my pocket. Every instruction they gave each other, every self-congratulatory whisper, every confirmation of their plan too. Exploit the shadow stitch and the restored dress. It would all be meticulously captured. The pain of their dismissal, the insistence that my life's work was nothing more than a burden was sharp. Yes, but that pain had been transmuted into an iron resolve. They had forced me to choose between my legacy and their avarice. And now, thanks to the impossible challenge of an antique dress, I knew exactly how to choose. I would reclaim my life, and they would pay the ultimate price for their lack of integrity. They believed my weariness was genuine, that my feigned fatigue was a sign of final surrender. I left Malachi and Zola in the main studio, their greedy hands already hovering over the restored antique dress. As the door to my small private office clicked shut, I didn't rest. I leaned against the cool wood, my mind racing, listening to the muffled, excited whispers that were now being captured by the voice recorder in my pocket. The real work had just begun, analyzing the central piece of the conspiracy, the dress. It was the linchpin of their entire scheme, the single item whose existence and value they needed to control. But to understand why they were so focused on this particular piece, you must understand the nature of the damage it sustained. It was the kind of damage that, in the world of high-end textile conservation, mandates retirement to tears so severe, so fundamental to the structure of the garment, that any ordinary repair would only devalue it further. The antique gown, a masterpiece of late Victorian silk and intricate lace, was inherently fragile. Every passing year had made its fibers more brittle, its tension more delicate. The laceration that ran down the bodice was not merely an unsightly cut. It was a physical argument against restoration. Most conservators would have advised documenting the damage, stabilizing the edges, and resigning the piece to a glass display case with a tragic plaque describing its final fate. But Amara, the young woman who brought it to me, understood something crucial that Malachi and Zola failed to grasp. The intrinsic value was not just in its age, but in its potential completeness. She knew that if anyone could resurrect it, it was me. Evelyn, the last living artisan who had mastered the lost arts of Langston Dubois. I went straight to my library, a small room lined with dusty, irreplaceable volumes on textile history and preservation. I pulled down the old heavy journal that detailed Dubois's methods. I needed to remind myself not of the how, but of the why. Why had this level of meticulous, invisible repair been developed in the first place? It was not for vanity. It was for legacy. It was the master craftsman's refusal to let history decay, simply because modern tools lacked the finesse to save it. The dress was a challenge designed by time and carelessness to be unfixable. By accepting the task, I had unconsciously signed up for a battle against the very principle of entropy. And now, that act of defiance was the only thing standing between my family's past and my children's avarice. The weight of the repair. It's less about the complexity of the knots and more about the historical obligation. This dress was linked to a specific lineage of high society textiles. A piece likely commissioned by one of the Gilded Age families whose names were synonymous with immense old wealth. The garment itself was a silent archive of social history, and its destruction would have meant the loss of that archival chapter. As I listened to the muffled voices from the main studio, Malachi demanding Zola find the insurance appraisal that didn't exist, and Zola nervously trying to photograph the dress from various angles, I began to mentally reconstruct the impossible repair. My method had to be flawless, undetectable, even under museum-grade magnification. A visible stitch would have invalidated the entire piece for the university exhibition and, more importantly, for Zola's scheme, the reason the dress was considered unfixable by others was due to the unique composition of the silk itself. It had been woven with threads defined for modern machine needles and too fragile to withstand the tension of traditional hand stitching. Any attempt at a conventional repair would have resulted in the surrounding, aged fabric tearing further, transforming a single laceration into a catastrophic explosion of fibers. This is precisely where the shadow stitch earned its name and its immense value. It was not a stitch applied to the fabric, but woven into the fabric's original structure. It required an almost surgical precision, using a custom-made needle and a specialized thread that matched the silk's refractive index, meaning the mending fiber would absorb and reflect light in the exact same manner as the antique original, making the repair disappear. Langston Dubois had spent 10 years developing this technique, viewing it as the pinnacle of restorative artistry. He famously said that the shadow stitch was the only way to honor the creator by silencing the restorer. If the shadow stitch was visible, it wasn't the shadow stitch. It was that simple and that difficult. The all-night repair session wasn't just physical labor. It was a meditative re-entry into a highly specialized, almost spiritual realm of craft. It was the moment Theodora, the retired, tired mother, fully transformed back into Evelyn, the matriarch of the needle, defending her legacy with every precise, vanishing stitch. The completion of that impossible repair was the first act of my financial vengeance. To understand the profound secrecy surrounding the shadow stitch is to understand why it's successful. Execution made the dress and, therefore, the studio a high-stakes target. The technique was not taught openly. Dubois deliberately kept the formula for the specialized thread a secret, knowing that in the wrong hands, it would be used to fabricate high-value antiques, not restore them. I, Evelyn, was the repository of that secret. The specific blend of natural silk, combined with a rare resin coating that stabilized the fragile antique fibers, was a formula I kept locked away in a safe deposit box, not in the studio. This was a detail Zola, with her financial degree and corporate cunning, had undoubtedly missed in her analysis of my assets. She assumed the technique was merely skill. I knew it was science, secured by proprietary knowledge. The dress itself became the undeniable proof of this mastery. Once restored, its flawless state was the market signal that the shadow stitch was real, viable, and still controlled by one person. And that one person was the matriarch. They were desperately trying to relegate to an assisted living facility. I could hear Zola, her voice tense and hushed, speaking to Malachi about the dress. It's flawless, Malachi. Look at the bodice. There is no seam, zero evidence of the repair. It's exactly what Dr. Vance at the Foundation described. The perfect, authentic restoration. We need to get this to the university discreetly. If anyone finds out Theodora did this work after she signed the contract, it changes everything. The cold realization in her voice was confirming my hypothesis. The shadow stitch was not just a skill. It was a certificate of authenticity for the restoration. Zola wasn't just interested in the property. She was interested in the professional prestige and the massive commission she could extract by facilitating the sale or exhibition of this piece, claiming she was the one who facilitated the discovery of the restored artifact. But Zola's panic over the contract was the true weakness. She correctly recognized that if the restoration could be dated after the contract signing, it would undermine their claim that the studio was a burden or that I was incapable. If I could perform a repair that professionals deemed impossible, then my mental and professional capacity was undeniable. The dress was my first, most powerful piece of evidence. The impossible repair had accomplished three things. Simultaneously, it had restored a priceless antique. It had reinstated my professional resolve. And it had forced Zola and Malachi to reveal the true, time-sensitive nature of their deception. They needed the dress out, and they needed me silent. Before the official university exhibition, the deadline, I had achieved through an all-night marathon of craftsmanship. I focused on the deeper emotional resonance of the dress. It wasn't just silk. It was a physical manifestation of integrity. The restoration was a metaphorical act of healing myself from the laceration of their contempt. Every stitch that vanished into the fabric was a stitch reclaiming my self-worth from the dismissive language of Malachi and Zola. The inherent difficulty of the repair was also my protection. If the dress had been a simple modern fix, they could have easily dismissed the work. But the sheer complexity of reviving a 100-year-old textile with a century-old secret technique demonstrated a level of genius that completely negated their claims of my incapacity or frailty. The dress spoke for itself, loudly and eloquently. Against their lies, I retrieved the voice recorder, briefly checking the timeline. Their conversation confirmed their intent. They were discussing how to quickly contact their contacts at the university, specifically Dr. Vance, the textile curator, to arrange a private viewing before the 9 a.m. public opening. The urgency was palpable. They wanted to stake their claim before anyone could interview Amara or, worse, me. Malachi's voice was now sharp with stress. We need to get the contract signed this afternoon, no matter what. If she can pull off a miracle like this, her lawyers will argue we pressured her. Zola, you handle the dress. Get it out of here now. Zola's response was a swift agreement, the sound of movement indicating she was carefully folding the restored dress. The plan was clear. They would use the flawless restoration, my work, to gain credibility, and then use the sale of the studio, my supposed incapacity, as a cover story to justify their sudden, deep involvement with the high-value antique. They were about to steal not only the physical credit for the work, but also the very proof of my resilience. The dress was about to leave the studio, but my evidence, my resolve, and my strategic intent would follow it closely. The final moments of the impossible repair had set the trap, and now they were confidently walking into the center of the snare. The successful completion of the shadow stitch was the foundation of my counter-strategy. The dress, flawless and beautiful, was now an unwitting participant in a high-stakes power struggle. It was my job to ensure its journey from the studio to the university exhibition became the pathway to Malachi and Zola's exposure. I listened to them arrange the transportation as secured courier service. Zola insisted on emphasizing the fragile historical nature of the package. Her sudden respect for the antiquity was nauseating, coming from the same woman who viewed my life's work as dust in decades. The dramatic irony of the situation was almost unbearable. They were paying a premium to rush the piece that would ultimately testify against them as they finalized the logistics. I quickly pulled out my personal cell phone. I bypassed Malachi and Zola entirely, calling the university's main line and asking to be immediately connected to Dr. Vance, the curator Zola had mentioned. I used the codename Langston Dubois had given me decades ago for emergency contact with the foundation. The curator was, understandably, skeptical at first. "Madam, the exhibition is opening in 3 hours. We are in lockdown. I am Evelyn Theodora," I stated, using the professional name I had earned, my voice cutting through his exhaustion. "I am calling about the late Victorian silk dress, the one with the irreparable bodice damage. I repaired it overnight using the shadow stitch. You need to know that the individual who is delivering it to you is not the owner, and is part of a scheme to suppress the evidence of the restoration." The silence on Dr. Vance's end was absolute. The name shadow stitch was enough. It was a legendary term in textile conservation, a technique widely considered lost forever. The realization that I was not only the living link to Dubois, but the one who had just completed the impossible repair instantly commanded his full, undivided attention. I didn't give him all the details. I simply alerted him to 3 crucial facts. I was the restorer. The dress was flawless, and the individual delivering it, Zola, was compromised. I told him Amara was the rightful academic liaison, and that Zola was attempting to preempt the public announcement to serve her own financial ends. I disconnected the call just as I heard the front door of the studio open, and Malachi loudly announced the arrival of the courier. The dress was leaving. My secret warning was already in place. The groundwork for the professional confrontation at the university had been laid, thanks to the very artifact they were trying to steal. The final moments of the dress's time in the studio were an intense, silent ballet of deceit. Zola oversaw the packaging with the meticulous care of a criminal covering her tracks, ensuring every label reflected her name or Malachi's firm as the primary contacts. She never once credited my work, confirming her intention to steal the professional recognition that would naturally accompany such a miraculous restoration. As the courier rolled the heavy, secured case out the front door, Malachi returned, carrying a celebratory box of expensive pastries. A pathetic attempt at a bribe to finalize the contract signing. His mood was buoyant, relieved, and sickeningly confident. The primary asset was secured, and they believed my defenses had crumbled. See, Mom? Malachi beamed, setting the box down on the desk. All handled. The difficult stuff is gone. Now that leaves us with just the paperwork. You can rest easy. We'll even throw in an extra $50,000 for the inconvenience. The inconvenience, that was the price they put on the erasure of my identity. The $50,000 was supposed to soothe the deep laceration they had inflicted on my relationship with my own son. I looked at the empty space on the cutting table. The faint outline of the magnificent antique dress still visible in the dust. The dress was gone. But it had left behind something far more valuable than the $50 million. It had left me with purpose and proof. The impossible repair had served its function. It proved my capability, resurrected my legacy, and forced my antagonists into a high-stakes public arena where their deceit would be far easier to expose. I took the pen the realtor had left earlier. Instead of signing the sales contract, I calmly wrote a short, dated note on the back of the form. Directly addressing Malachi and Zola, the dress was restored on November 17th after you pressured me to sell. The shadow stitch is undeniable. I suggest you cancel the realtor immediately. The burden is no longer mine. I placed the pen down and left the note on top of the unsigned contract. The time for feigned weakness was over. The impossible repair was complete, and its implications would now change everything for Malachi and Zola. My next move was to meet the dress at the exhibition and deliver the final, devastating blow. The studio was suddenly silent again. A quiet that felt profoundly different from the exhausted silence of my initial despair. This new silence was tactical, the quiet before the explosion. Malachi and Zola had departed, smugly convinced they had won the first round by securing the antique dress. They had overlooked the note I left them, certain their hasty escape was complete. They completely failed to grasp that the true value of the dress was never about the silk itself, but the hidden knowledge used to mend it. The shadow stitch. The term sounds ethereal, almost mythical, and to the vast majority of the textile world, it was precisely that. A legend whispered in hushed tones among high-end conservators, a technique so precise, so demanding, that most professionals believed it had died with my mentor, Langston Dubois, decades ago. They were wrong. And my singular possession of that knowledge was the secret weapon that would dismantle my family's financial conspiracy. Dubois never viewed his work as mere mending. He viewed it as temporal restoration. He believed that a true master restorer should leave no trace of their passage, that the final piece should appear as if the damage had never occurred. The shadow stitch was his crowning achievement in this philosophy. It was the antithesis of the modern, industrial approach to repair that Malachi and Zola celebrated: quick, visible, and replaceable. The shadow stitch was slow, invisible, and utterly unique. To understand its $50,000 valuation, a figure far exceeding any standard repair fee, one must understand the proprietary components. It was not a single skill, but a trifecta of secret knowledge. The thread formula, the needle geometry, and the tension matrix. Without all three, the stitch would immediately fail, either by tearing the delicate antique fiber or, worse, by becoming visibly discernible under forensic lighting. I moved from the desk, leaving the damning note where they would inevitably find it, and retrieved the small velvet-lined box from my private safe. Inside were the instruments of the shadow stitch, for needles, each hand-ground from aerospace-grade steel by Dubois himself, and a tiny, labeled glass vial containing the raw components for the special resin. These tools were more valuable than the entire square footage of the studio. They represented a legacy of mastery that Malachi could not audit and Zola could not sell. They believed they possessed a high-value antique, but I had just proved that I possessed the priceless, unique key required to unlock that antique's full financial and historical potential. The thread formula was the first and most critical secret. Modern silk thread, no matter how fine, possesses a different molecular structure and reflective index than antique silk. If you mend 1890s silk with 2020s thread, the repair will glow under the specific lighting used in museum environments, immediately invalidating the restoration. Dubois engineered a thread that contained a proprietary blend of natural silk mixed with a near-invisible synthetic polymer. This polymer, derived from a rare South American plant extract, was the key to mimicking the light absorption properties of century-old fabric. My knowledge of this formula, passed down through decades of practice and recorded only in coded entries within my private journals, was the reason I was the sole living master of the shadow stitch. It was a secret I had guarded not out of greed, but out of respect for its potential for forgery. A world where everyone knew the shadow stitch would be a world where no antique textile could ever be trusted again. The needle geometry was the second crucial component. Standard sewing needles are too blunt, too heavy, and create too much drag. They push the fabric aside, leaving microscopic tears that weaken the mended area. The shadow stitch requires a needle with a specific elongated elliptical eye and a blade that is diamond-edged to minimize friction. The needles in my velvet box were the only 4 of their kind in existence, requiring a precise, proprietary sharpening process that only I could perform. Working with the shadow stitch was an act of high-wire discipline. It demanded not only technical expertise, but a perfect meditative calm. Any tremor, any distraction, the kind of psychological distress Malachi and Zola had so expertly tried to induce would result in catastrophic failure. The antique dress, damaged and fragile, was the perfect test of my resolve. By successfully completing the repair under immense pressure, I had inadvertently demonstrated to myself, and soon to the world, that my focus was sharper than ever. The tension matrix was the final secret, the methodology. This involved the precise mapping of the fabric's existing tension lines and applying the stitch in a nonlinear, almost geometric pattern. It was less like sewing and more like reinforcing an architectural structure using invisible buttresses. This methodology ensured that when the antique dress was worn or displayed, the mended area would move, flex, and drape exactly as the original fabric, without any puckering or stiffness. The sheer complexity of the shadow stitch explains the $50,000 price tag. A fee Langston Dubois once charged for restoring a single irreplaceable banner. That money wasn't for the hour. It was for the irreducible rarity of the skill, the 40 years of dedication, and the proprietary knowledge that guaranteed the restoration's permanence and authenticity. For Malachi and Zola, the shadow stitch represented pure, unadulterated opportunity. They were not textile experts, but they were astute enough to recognize a market monopoly when they saw one. Zola's research, I now realized, hadn't just focused on my assets. It had focused on Dubois's history, and she must have stumbled across references to the shadow stitch in Art Foundation archives. She knew its value, and she knew the only path to it led directly through me. Their initial plan must have been simple: force me to sell the studio and retire, gain access to my inventory under the guise of an assessment, and then quietly leverage the restored dress and possibly the thread formula itself, which they hoped was stored locally, to gain instant credibility and enormous financial gain in the exclusive world of art restoration. They wanted to market the dress as a newly discovered masterpiece, restored by anonymous experts facilitated by Zola's connections, thereby cutting me, Evelyn, the true restorer, completely out of the narrative. The genius of their betrayal lay in their attempt to simultaneously monetize my genius and neutralize my control. But by demanding I complete the repair, the antique dress had become the single piece of physical evidence that defied their narrative. The dress was now stamped with an invisible signature, the undeniable, perfectly executed shadow stitch, and that signature pointed directly to the studio, to me, and to the date of the repair, which was after their maximum pressure campaign. The fact that Zola, in her haste, had insisted on coordinating the delivery to Dr. Vance at the foundation, the very institution I had called earlier was the fatal flaw in her execution. She believed she was securing her access. She was actually delivering the evidence directly to the witness I had already primed. The true brilliance of the shadow stitch was its ability to certify itself. If an expert textile curator like Dr. Vansois told a piece was restored using the technique, their immediate professional protocol would be to examine the mended area under specific light and magnification. If the stitch truly vanished, it could only mean one person had done the work. If it didn't vanish, it meant the claim was fraudulent. I knew that Dr. Vance, having received my urgent cryptic phone call detailing the repair and Zola's imminent arrival, would be ready to perform that forensic examination. My claim of being the master restorer would be immediately verifiable by the dress itself, turning the artifact into my most powerful silent witness. This was the beautiful irony. Malachi and Zola were depending on the high-value status of the Shadow Stitch restoration to sell their story of discovery. Yet the very perfection of the stitch guaranteed their exposure. They were leveraging a truth they could not control. I spent a few minutes in the quiet studio, carefully cleaning the specialized needles and replacing the vial of resin. This was my personal moment of reflection, recognizing that the battle had moved far beyond just my relationship with my son. It was now a defense of the integrity of craftsmanship against the mercenary impulses of the financial world. The $50,000 technique was not just about money. It was about legacy maintenance. Every master artisan faces a choice: hoard the secret or pass it on to a trusted apprentice. Dubois had chosen the latter, and I, Evelyn, was the living proof of his trust. Malachi and Zola, by trying to steal the fruit of that legacy, had proven themselves unworthy of inheriting anything not the studio, not the skill, and certainly not my respect. Their dismissal of my life as a burden was a profound misjudgment. They saw a tired elderly woman. They missed the focused, determined master who had just pulled off the impossible in a single night. The moment they left with the dress, believing they had secured the central piece of their treasure, they had walked into a trap constructed entirely out of silk science and 60 years of focused determination, the genius of the shadow stitch, which allowed the antique dress to become flawless, would now serve as the undetectable fuse to their undoing. The successful restoration created a chain reaction. It forced Zola to rush the delivery. It gave me the professional proof needed to call Dr. Vance, and it ensured that the moment Zola tried to take credit, she would fail the most basic forensic test. I imagined the scene unfolding at the university archives. Zola, sleek and confident, presenting the artifact as a grand discovery facilitated by her investments in the arts. Dr. Vance, skeptical but intrigued by my phone call, would carefully take the dress. He wouldn't look for the tear. He would look for the repair. He would examine the bodice not for imperfection, but for the telltale signs of the shadow stitch. When he found nothing, when the repair truly vanished under the light, he would know two things immediately. First, the dress had been restored by Evelyn Theodora. And second, the woman standing in front of him, Zola, was attempting to perpetrate a high-profile fraud by claiming credit for the work of a master. The silence of the stitch would become Zola's loudest accusation. The risk of the shadow stitch was always the possibility of exposure. If I had failed, the tear would have worsened and the dress would have become a worthless relic. But because I succeeded, the antique dress was transformed into a multi-million-dollar asset, certified by a unique skill that only one person knew. This made my life, my studio, and my presence not just desirable, but absolutely essential to the garment's legitimacy. They had targeted the studio, convinced its assets were static and easy to liquidate. They had underestimated the fact that its greatest asset, my brain and my hands, was constantly evolving and capable of producing instant, massive value that they could not contain. The $50,000 technique was the ultimate non-transferable wealth, residing solely within the Matriarch. I secured the studio, ensuring the note I left for Malachi was prominently displayed on the contract. It was time to leave my fortress and follow the dress. I was not going to the university to watch Zola succeed. I was going to witness the moment the shadow stitch delivered its final, silent verdict of guilt. I took one last long look around the golden needle. The cutting table was clean, the needles were stored, and the silence felt heavy with anticipation. The studio had done its job. It had provided the crucible for the shadow, stitches, execution, and the physical proof of my competence. The battle was now relocating to the high-stakes arena of the art world, where intellectual property was currency and integrity was rarely found. I placed the activated voice recorder on the desk, ensuring it would capture Malachi and Zola's reaction when they eventually saw my note and realized their plan had been irrevocably compromised. I wanted evidence of their rage, their sudden panic, and their desperate scrambling to mitigate the damage. The knowledge of the shadow stitch was the true inheritance I had to protect. It was a tangible link to a world where skill and patience transcended the quick money schemes of my children. By trying to steal the restored dress, they were trying to convert my legacy into their liquidity. But by successfully executing the technique, I had proven that true legacy is non-transferable, non-fungible, and fundamentally controlled by the Creator. Alone, my final thought before leaving the sanctuary was this: the antique dress, once a symbol of fragility and loss, was now a powerful emblem of resilience and truth. The shadow stitch had not just mended silk, it had mended my will. It had given me the leverage, the evidence, and the unwavering confidence needed to face down my own family and reclaim my identity. I stepped out of the studio and locked the heavy oak door. The university was miles away, but the outcome was already sealed. The shadow stitch, the secret technique only one person knew, was about to deliver its final, devastating judgment. The stage was set for the public unmasking of the family betrayal. The irony of leaving a final, defiant note on top of an unsigned contract was a moment of profound satisfaction. But emotional victories rarely win financial wars. Even as I drove toward the university, preparing for the public confrontation, a chilling realization settled over me. The true nature of their betrayal likely wasn't just physical theft. It was legal entrapment. The contract, the very document Malachi had thrust upon me repeatedly, the one disguised as a simple property sale, suddenly demanded re-examination. Why the obsessive, desperate push to sign that specific day? Why the urgency that bordered on panic? It wasn't just about selling the land. It was about activating a hidden clause that would guarantee them ownership of not just the studio, but its historical and intellectual contents. My expertise lay in silk and thread, not in jurisprudence, but decades of dealing with high value. Bespoke commissions had taught me one thing: the devil always hides in the fine print. I pulled over briefly, retrieving my old hard copy briefcase. It contained the initial draft of the sales agreement Malachi had first presented months ago, before their pressure campaign began. The opening hook to this deeper, more insidious conspiracy lay in the language of Schedule B, the section typically reserved for listing fixtures and fittings. In the early draft, it was standard language: all attached shelving fixtures and permanent appliances, clean, acceptable. But the final contract, the one Malachi had rushed me to sign, contained a subtle, yet catastrophic amendment to Schedule B. It had been changed to include the phrase, all contents pertaining to the operational history of the Golden Needle Studio, including but not limited to specialized equipment, archived materials, and intellectual property records. The phrase intellectual property records was the cold, hard proof of their malice. It wasn't just a physical inventory they wanted to assess. It was the shadow stitch formula, the coded journals, and the entire professional legacy of Langston Dubois that they intended to acquire under the guise of buying a dilapidated building. They weren't just greedy. They were attempting a sophisticated, calculated transfer of historical knowledge that, unsigned, would legally strip me of my life's work. The discovery of this hidden clause transformed the simple act of selling a building into a monumental act of professional and intellectual surrender. The inclusion of the term intellectual property records confirmed that Zola, with her business acumen, was the brains behind the operation, transforming Malachi's crude greed into a precise legal instrument. She knew that the antique dress, once authenticated by the shadow stitch, would attract global attention from collectors and foundations, all of whom would eventually trace the restoration back to the source. By signing that clause, I would have essentially legalized the theft of my identity. They would not have had to argue about who restored the dress. They would simply present the signed contract, proving that all knowledge pertaining to the restoration, the thread formula, the tension matrix, the client records was legally transferred to the new owner, them, or a shell corporation they controlled. The cruelty of this clause was layered. It ensured that even if I eventually proved I had performed the repair before the sale, the knowledge required to validate that repair would belong to them. They could legally discredit me by claiming I had illegally retained copies of the transferred intellectual property. I felt a surge of cold, focused anger that transcended simple frustration. This was not a disagreement over money. This was a generational attempt to erase my history and monetize my most sacred, guarded secrets. They had weaponized bureaucracy against the bond of motherhood. I realized that the all-night repair was not just a restoration. It was the creation of evidence outside their legal capture, because the repair was completed hours before I left the note threatening the foundation. The intellectual property was demonstrably used while it was still legally mine. This established a crucial timeline, but the danger remained. If I hadn't read the contract, if I had signed under the exhaustion they had engineered, my entire legacy, the history of Langston Dubois, the years of mastery would have become their property, a tradable asset in their portfolio of exploitation. The speed and aggression with which they pushed the contract revealed their vulnerability. They were racing against the university exhibition. They needed the legal framework in place before the shadow stitch was publicly authenticated by Dr. Vance. They needed the IP clause to be active before the world recognized the immense value I controlled. The physical act of rereading that clause, intellectual property records, was like looking into the cold, calculated heart of my children's avarice. It demonstrated a level of planning that went far beyond selling a simple house. This was a long-term strategy designed to extract maximum silent wealth from a source they considered incapable of fighting back. I considered what I would have done had I signed. Malachi and Zola would have likely established a new, high-end textile consulting firm, using the acquired knowledge of the shadow stitch to charge exorbitant fees for authentication and restoration work. They would become the instant authorities on Dubois's legacy, having purchased the right to claim the knowledge from a retiring mother. The sheer dismissal of my professional life was the greatest wound. They saw the value of the knowledge, yet refused to acknowledge the value of the creator. They wanted the fruit without honoring the tree. I realized that their aggressive push to sign the paperwork was tied to the need to prove my mental and emotional compliance. They needed a clean, unpressured signature to validate the transfer of the IP clause. Their tactics, their repeated visits, the financial worry, the insistence on my frailty were all designed to wear down my critical thinking until I signed the document without truly reading it. The Matriarch had become a quarry, chased not by hunters with guns, but by lawyers with meticulously worded legal forms. The weapon was not violence, but the manipulation of trust and familial obligation to discovery of the hidden clause was the single most clarifying moment in the entire conflict. It removed all doubt about their motivations. This was not concern. This was a corporate takeover dressed up in the language of filial piety. The moment I saw those words, the last vestiges of motherly love for the architects of this scheme evaporated, replaced by the cool, hard resolve of an adversary. I carefully photographed the page containing the clause and the date of the final draft, evidence of their deliberate deception now secured on my phone. This evidence, combined with the successful execution of the shadow stitch and the recorded conversations, formed a triple-layered defense that no legal team could easily dismantle. The hidden clause was their most guarded secret, but it was the timing of the contract's arrival that was the critical flaw in their planning. Malachi and Zola had brought the finalized papers just as the antique dress arrived. They were so focused on securing the IP before the exhibition that they failed to consider that the dress would require immediate, all-night work, a marathon of craftsmanship that would leave me too exhausted to read the fine print, but also too professionally invigorated to sign the betrayal. The contract had been their safety net. They intended to finalize the IP transfer regardless of whether the shadow stitch had been applied or not. But the successful completion of the restoration transformed the paper agreement from a simple asset transfer into a catastrophic liability for them. The moment the dress was finished, the value of the IP clause skyrocketed. They were rushing to capture a golden goose that was now laying a multi-million-dollar egg. And by rushing, they became careless. I recalled Zola's fleeting look of triumph when I pointed her towards the dress. That look was not just recognition of an antique. It was the satisfaction of a corporate raider finding the central asset. She knew the shadow stitch was the key, and she assumed the contract would instantly give them the legal right to exploit that key. This realization armed me not just with evidence, but with strategic foresight. I knew where they would strike next. They would use the pretense of insurance inventory to get the rest of my private journals and documents, the physical evidence of the shadow stitch's components. They would try to clean out the evidence of my intellectual ownership before I realized what the contract truly meant. I had left my note a brief, defiant statement mentioning the shadow stitch and the date of its application specifically to disrupt this process. That note was designed to induce panic, forcing them to abandon the delicate inventory assessment and focus entirely on the looming legal catastrophe. I secured the original, clean draft of the contract in my safe, ensuring I had proof of the malicious amendment they had introduced at the last minute. This clean copy would be devastating evidence in any court, proving deliberate light-stage deception against a parent. This was financial vengeance, served with the ice-cold precision of a master tailor's shears. The entire structure of the betrayal rested on two pillars: my physical exhaustion and my emotional trust. They leveraged my love for Malachi, believing I would always prioritize his perceived financial well-being over my own professional legacy. The hidden contract clause proved they were willing to violate that trust for their own enrichment. As I drove toward the university, preparing for the public unveiling of the shadow stitch, I felt a deep sense of separation. They were no longer my children. They were adversaries in a highly specialized intellectual conflict. The matriarch had detached the emotional heart to allow the professional brain to take over. The insidious nature of the clause was that it tried to invalidate my history, even before I surrendered the physical studio. It stated that by signing the contract, I agreed that the IP transfer was retroactive to the date the contract was first drafted, further complicating any timeline I might try to present. They tried to lock the past, present, and future into their legal framework. But the one thing they couldn't control was the knowledge of the key. They needed the physical IP records, my journals, my notes, to prove they possessed the knowledge. I had ensured those records were safe, secured far from the studio they intended to acquire. The recorded conversation I had in my pocket was the perfect counterbalance to the contract's written betrayal. It documented them eagerly discussing the assessment and the shadow stitch, proving they were engaging in an unauthorized retrieval of property they had not yet legally acquired, all while pretending to be concerned about my health. The discrepancy between their recorded actions and the contract's benevolent language would be damning. I was not just fighting for a building. I was fighting for the right to intellectual ownership in old age. My case would set a precedent that skill, wisdom, and specialized knowledge do not automatically become public or purchasable property simply because the creator is deemed old or tired. The matriarch's will was not a document. It was a commitment to professional sovereignty, the realization of the full extent of the Betrayal, the insidious hidden clauses, provided the matriarch with the necessary finality. There would be no reconciliation, no forgiveness until justice was served. They had crossed the Rubicon of familial obligation and stepped firmly onto the cold, barren ground of corporate malfeasance. The contract remained unsigned, but the battle had already moved to the next phase. My leaving the note was a strategic declaration of war. It forced them to read the situation for once, not through the lens of greed, but through the lens of pure, imminent risk. They would now be scrambling to find out what I knew, who I had called, and whether the shadow stitch had truly been applied. I arrived at the university. The halls were bustling with students and staff preparing for the grand opening. The venue was sterile and modern, the perfect antithesis to the warm, cluttered history of the Golden Needle. I took a deep breath, smoothing the simple, precisely tailored jacket I wore. I was not dressed for conflict. I was dressed for professional authority. I was about to walk into an art exhibition where a masterpiece I had restored was about to be unveiled. But the true unveiling would not be of the antique dress. It would be the exposure of the hidden contract clause and the cold, unfeeling greed it represented. The time for quiet craftsmanship was over. The time for assertive justice, driven by the violation of a mother's trust, was now. The matriarch was about to step into the light, armed with the silent evidence of her skill and the damning proof of her children's betrayal. When I finally drove away from the Golden Needle, leaving the contract unsigned and my cryptic note as a ticking time bomb for Malachi and Zola, my mind was not on the legal battle unfolding at the university. My mind was still anchored in the deep, quiet hours of the night before, the sacred solitude where the shadow stitch was resurrected. This segment of the story is not about betrayal. It is about reclamation. The all-night effort was not merely a race against Amara's morning deadline. It was a desperate internal struggle against the psychological decay that my own family had inflicted. For weeks, they had convinced me that my skill was antiquated. My studio was a liability, and my time was better spent waiting for death than creating life. The sudden arrival of the antique dress was the ultimate contradiction to their narrative. I remember the exact moment the shift occurred. It was around 2 a.m. The initial rush of adrenaline from Amara's urgent request had faded, replaced by the profound, demanding exhaustion of true, difficult work. I was deep into the first phase of the shadow stitch, the meticulous process of tracing the antique silk's original tension. My eyes were burning, my hands ached with the fatigue of decades. And the pressure to fail was immense. In that moment of vulnerability, Malachi's voice, played back in my memory, was insidious. "It's too much, Mom. You're too old for this burden. Just relax." That word burden was a poison. I had almost accepted it, almost allowed their transactional view of life to define my creative existence. But as I leaned closer to the silk, magnifying the fibers, I saw not a burden, but a covenant. The dress was screaming for a master's touch, begging for the continuity of history, and my hands, though tired, remembered the oath I had taken under Langston Dubois to preserve integrity above all else. The antique dress, with its near-impossible tear, was the mirror reflecting the tear in my own sense of purpose. And as I began to weave the invisible thread, realized the healing of the fabric was simultaneously the healing of the matriarch. In that quiet effort, the pursuit of purpose became exponentially more valuable than any prophet Malachi. And Zola could offer the difference between my all-night effort and Malachi's all-day rush to secure the contract was the difference between creation and extraction. Malachi pursued prophetar, temporary fungible thing, while I pursued mastery on intrinsic, permanent state of being. The physical demands of the shadow stitch were unlike any other mending. It required a control so fine that I had to synchronize my needle movements with my breathing. Each delicate insertion had to be made between the existing weave, not through it, ensuring zero disruption to the aged fibers. It was a meditative state that forced out all external noise, including the draining voices of my family's deceit. This period of work was my rebellion. while Malachi and Zola were likely celebrating their impending victory, the securement of the antique assets, performing the very act that would invalidate their claims. They thought I was resting. I was sharpening the weapon that would cut them down. The sheer value of the completed dress, the multi-million-dollar figure it would command on the historical textile market, was a concept that barely registered in the studio that night. The only value that mattered was the value of the challenge, to prove not to my children, but to myself, that the matriarch's hands had not lost their skill, and that the matriarch's will had not broken. There was a profound sense of self-rescue in the darkness. Every precise stitch was an answer to every condescending remark. Too old. The precision required demanded the focus of a scientist, not the carelessness of age. Burden. The work provided a clarity and meaning that the sterile retirement they offered never could. The antique dress was the perfect antagonist for my art. It was old, fragile, and represented a forgotten era of quality. By saving it, I was not just saving silk. I was saving the argument for the permanence of true craftsmanship. I was confirming that some things like talent, experience, and integrity cannot be bought or sold. They can only be earned and preserved through tireless effort. The profit was merely the consequence. The purpose was the entire foundation. As the clock ticked past 4 a.m., the studio's atmosphere shifted again. The initial urgency was replaced by a deep flowing rhythm, the craftsman's zone. This quiet focus was the antithesis of the chaotic, fast-paced world of my children's brokerage and consulting firms. They chased quarterly returns. I chased timeless perfection. I thought about the young woman Amara. Her panic had been genuine, rooted in the fear of losing her academic credibility and, more importantly, betraying the trust placed in her by the historical foundation. Her panic was clean. Malachi and Zola's panic, which I had just evaded, was toxic, rooted in the fear of losing an undeserved commission. The all-night effort became a physical comparison between these two forms of motivation. Amara's desire to preserve history fueled my hands. Malachi and Zola's desire to liquidate history fueled their deceit. And it was in that quiet room, under the harsh light of my work lamp, that I consciously chose the higher value. I chose the value of the aesthetic victory over the temptation of the financial reward. The completion of the shadow stitch required the final application of the proprietary resin to set the threads. This step was crucial. It meant I had to open the small secured viola gesture that always felt profound. The scent of the resin, a faint, complex aroma of rare botanicals and old silk, was the matriarch's personal perfume, the smell of a secret guarded for decades. As I worked the final, vanishing threads, I wasn't thinking about the $50 million appraisal the dress would receive. I was thinking about Langston Dubois, his faith in me, and the sacred trust he had placed in my hands. That trust, that legacy, was the fortune. That was the irreducible asset I was fighting to protect from my own blood. The true moment purpose eclipsed. Profit came when I realized I would refuse any payment from Amara. The compensation was already complete. The restoration of my own sense of self. The sheer act of performing the impossible repair was the only reward I needed. It was my affirmation that Theodora was still Evelyn, the master restorer, and not the exhausted, compliant relic my children demanded. Current subtitle: The all-night effort, the moment purpose, became more valuable than profit. The silent, unwritten contract I honored that night was with Langston Dubois, not with Amara. It was a commitment to the art form itself. When you work with textiles that are a century old, you are dealing with a material history that deserves dignity. To rush the work, to apply a visible stitch for the sake of speed, would have been a form of professional vandalism. Malachi and Zola would never understand this concept. They operated on speed, volume, and turnover. Their valuation model had no column for integrity or historical permanence. Their entire lives were built on the belief that everything has a price tag and everything is replaceable. My all-night effort was a living, breathing proof that their philosophy was fundamentally bankrupt. as the sun began to rise. Painting the studio window with soft, pale light, the work was finally done. I didn't need a final inspection. The sensation in my hands, the quiet confidence that settled over me, was enough. The tear had vanished. The bodice was seamless, resilient, and ready for display. The antique dress, once ruined, was now perfect. I gently lifted the dress, holding it up to the light. The silk flowed, undisturbed. The area I had worked on moved with the same fluid grace as the original fabric, a testament to the meticulous application of the tension matrix. This was not a mending. It was an act of artistic reversal. This moment of completion was the true climax of my personal story. It was the instant Theodora, the matriarch, stood up from the exhaustion of her family's pressure and remembered who she was. The stress of the financial burden, the worry over the contract, the fear of aging, all of it dissolved into the cold, clear triumph of the craft. I looked at the unsigned contract lying on the desk. That document represented the financial temptation, the easy way out. The dress represented the difficult, honorable path of preservation. In the light of the morning sun, the choice was hilariously clear. The comfort they offered was a delusion. The truth of my purpose was tangible, real, and hanging in my hands. The matriarch's new resolve was rooted in this physical achievement. The shadow stitch was no longer just a technique. It was a symbol of my refusal to be erased. This quiet victory was the necessary counterbalance to the loud, aggressive invasion of Malachi and Zola. I began the slow, deliberate process of securing the studio. I carefully covered the dress, not to hide the repair, but to protect the finished work until Amara returned. I cleaned my tools, replacing the special needles back into the velvet box. Every action was measured, precise, and filled with a sense of focused power. It was during this cleanup that I retrieved the voice recorder. I needed to ensure that my actions were not just based on feeling, but on documented fact. The discovery of the hidden contract clause had already armed me legally, but the documented proof of my creative capacity, performed while they claimed I was incapacitated, was the final piece of the professional puzzle. The juxtaposition was stark. While I was engaged in an act of artistic integrity, they were engaged in an act of sophisticated greed. This disparity made the path forward absolutely unambiguous. There was no longer a question of if I should expose them, but how and when the final, devastating blow should land. Amara arrived shortly after 7 a.m., her face etched with exhaustion and profound anxiety. When she saw the restored dress, her relief was instantaneous and overwhelming. She didn't check for flaws. She simply wept with gratitude. "Theodora," she whispered, "I don't know how you did it. They said it was impossible. You saved the exhibition. You saved my career." I accepted her gratitude not as payment, but as recognition. And when she pulled out her checkbook, offering a substantial fee for the emergency repair, I shook my head gently. "The fee is already paid, my dear. The work was its own reward. Just promise me one thing. Ensure that when this dress is displayed, the history of its restoration, the integrity of the craft is never compromised." This refusal of profit, witnessed by Amara, became the final, crucial act of my internal transformation. I had firmly rejected the transactional world of Malachi and Zola, proving that my purpose, my dedication to a higher standard of excellence was, in fact, the most valuable asset I possessed. Amara secured the dress for transport, meticulously placing it into the courier's case. Her careful handling was a final validation of my efforts, respectful acknowledgement of the masterpiece I had just preserved. She was my first unintentional ally in the fight for my legacy. Just as Amara was leaving, Alaya and Zola arrived, bearing the pastries and the sales contract. They saw the courier case leaving and assumed the asset had been secured by them. They missed the subtle, focused determination in my eyes, mistaking it for the exhaustion they had worked so hard to induce. I played the role perfectly, the weary matriarch who had finally broken. I admitted exhaustion, pointed them toward the area where the dress had been, and feigned ignorance of the specifics of the courier transfer. My exhaustion was the perfect veil for my strategic maneuvers. My all-night effort was now complete. It had achieved far more than just mending silk. It proved my professional competence. Invalidating their claims of my mental incapacity, it provided the physical evidence the shadow stitch needed to verify my identity to Dr. Vance. It solidified my moral position, proving that I valued purpose over the quick profits they craved. The moment Amara departed with the perfectly restored dress, the matriarch knew the game was in motion. The dress was headed toward its public unveiling, and Malachi and Zola were rushing to secure the legal claim to a restoration they hadn't performed. They were confident, careless, and completely unprepared for the professional confrontation that awaited them. I waited until they were deep in their inventory assessment, examining the area where the dress had been before feigning my departure for rest. I left the studio, the sound of their muffled, greedy whispers fading behind me, recorded and saved. The shadow stitch had delivered its gift of purpose, and now that purpose would fuel the matriarch's final, devastating act of financial vengeance. The critical moment of my departure from the studio, feigning exhaustion while leaving my children to assess the inventory, was meticulously planned. I knew that the moment I was out of sight, their masks would drop. The air would be filled not with expressions of concern, but with the cold, raw calculation of corporate raiders who thought they had secured their loot. My voice recorder, discreetly activated and left near the cutting table, was not a hidden camera in the physical sense, but it was the unblinking eye of truth. It captured the audio evidence, the unguarded whispers, the hasty planning, the self-congratulatory greed that would later serve as the foundation of their public downfall. This simple device was my final insurance policy against the legal gymnastics of the hidden contract clause. As I drove toward the university, I pulled over to listen to the initial moments of the recording. The silence of my departure was immediately shattered by Zola's voice, sharp with relief and command. "He's gone. She's finally resting. Malachi, forget the shelving. Find the cleaning supplies we need to wipe down the surface where the dress was sitting. No loose fibers." Her immediate concern wasn't the supposed burden of the studio. It was forensics. She was trying to sanitize the area, perhaps to remove any physical evidence that I had performed the work. This confirmed her intention to present the dress as an artifact recovered and restored under her guidance, completely erasing my involvement. Malachi's response was equally damning, his relief translating into reckless certainty. "Forget the rag, Zola. The shadow stitch is secure. That old woman actually did it. Can you believe it? That piece is worth more than the entire property now. We need to focus on securing the rest of her notes before she wakes up and remembers what she knows." This short exchange was gold. It was a clear, unambiguous admission of three things: Zola's attempt to erase evidence, Malachi's verification of the shadow stitch's successful application, which contradicted their claim of my incapacity, and their clear intent to steal my intellectual property records. The recorded words were 1,000 times more powerful than any legal document because they revealed the pure, malicious intent behind the contract. The recorded evidence eliminated all ambiguity. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a conspiracy. Their subsequent conversation documented their next steps, confirming my suspicions about the university exhibition. Zola, I just spoke to Dr. Vance. I told him the restoration expert. It's anonymous, and that our firm facilitated the recovery of the dress from an undocumented private collection. I need to get this piece authenticated by the shadow stitch's perfection, but I need to make sure he only talks to me. Malachi, good. Keep the focus on your firm's discovery. The contract signing this afternoon guarantees us the IP, so she can't prove anything later. Just don't let Vance see that she wrote anything down about the shadow stitch. This exchange was the smoking gun. Zola was actively lying to Dr. Vance and the Langston Dubois Foundation, creating a fraudulent narrative of undocumented recovery to bypass the matriarch and claim the credit. They were using the technical perfection of my work to validate her lie. The true value of the dress was now clear. It was the launchpad for Zola's career in the highly lucrative world of art authentication and brokerage. By claiming the restoration and securing the IP, she would instantly become a primary authority on Dubois's rare techniques, a position worth far more than any commission on a single building sale. The audio evidence provided the necessary counterproof to neutralize the hidden contract clause. The clause was designed to transfer my knowledge, but the recording proved they were acting on that knowledge before the legal transfer was complete. Based on a fraudulent narrative, it demonstrated premeditation and intent to deceive. I immediately contacted my personal lawyer, not to fight the contract, but to prepare the legal disclosure that would accompany the audio file. I explained the situation calmly, detailing the hidden contract clause and the recorded evidence of their plan to commit fraud against the foundation. My lawyer, accustomed to high-stakes estate battles, immediately understood the gravity of the situation. The battle had shifted from a private family dispute to a potential case of corporate and art world malfeasance. My conversation with the lawyer was brief, but precise. I needed immediate surgical intervention, not a prolonged court case. The goal was to invalidate Zola's claims, publicly and professionally, at the university exhibition itself. I gave the lawyer clear instructions. First, draft a legal notice to the foundation stating my intellectual property ownership and my role as the sole restorer of the dress. Second, prepare the audio transcript from the recorded conversation to be used as evidence of Zola's fraud attempt. The lawyer's speed and understanding reaffirmed my choice of legal counsel. Unlike Malachi, who valued cheap, quick solutions, my team understood the value of meticulous, overwhelming proof. Now, my focus shifted entirely to Dr. Vance. I had warned him earlier, but now I needed to give him the full damning context. I found a quiet corner near the university library and called his office again. He answered immediately, his voice now crisp and professional, devoid of the previous skepticism. "Madam Evelyn, the dress arrived minutes ago. It is flawless. We are setting up the examination now. The shadow stitch. It's breathtaking. Truly a lost art." The verification was complete. The dress, my silent witness, had delivered its proof. "Dr. Vance," I responded, my voice low and authoritative, "I appreciate your verification. Now I must alert you to the next step of the fraud. Zola, the woman who delivered it, is attempting to claim that her firm recovered and facilitated the restoration anonymously. She is lying. I have a recording that proves she and my son planned to steal the intellectual property of the shadow stitch and claim ownership of my work." I paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle. "I will be arriving at the exhibition hall shortly. Do not allow Zola to present the dress. Delay the announcement and keep her occupied. My lawyer will be sending you the full legal disclosure and the audio transcript within the next hour." Dr. Vance's commitment was immediate. He was a man of integrity, deeply dedicated to the preservation of history. Zola's attempt to use the foundation as a shield for her fraud had enraged the very institution she sought to impress. The stage was now set for the public implosion. The walk from the parking lot to the university exhibition hall was the Matriarch's final march into battle. I was no longer afraid of confrontation. I welcomed it. The anxiety that had plagued me for weeks had been replaced by the cold, focused determination of a woman who knows she holds all the evidence. I entered the lobby just as a small crowd of media, students and donors, was gathering for the exhibition's grand opening. I could see Zola standing near the security cordon, radiating false importance. Her phone pressed to her ear as she frantically tried to finalize details. She was attempting to control a situation that was already spiraling far beyond her. The irony was thick enough to cut with my antique shears. Zola, who had dismissed my life as a relic, was now leveraging that same relic to become relevant. She believed her careful corporate maneuvering would triumph over my quiet artistry. She did not know that the very air around Hertha's space in the abandoned studio had betrayed her. I stayed near the entrance, observing the unfolding drama, Dr. Vance, looking tense and professional, approached Zola. I couldn't hear the words, but the rigid posture and the sudden lack of polite smiles indicated the confrontation was well underway. Zola's body language was defensive. She kept gesturing toward the secured display case that held the dress, her voice rising in pitch. Vance maintained a quiet, professional dignity, the kind of quiet authority that always unnerved corporate schemers like Zola. He was clearly demanding proof of her claims, forcing her to account for the anonymous expert and the undocumented recovery. The matriarch knew exactly what Zola was attempting to do: stall. Zola was confident that the hidden contract clause would soon activate, giving her the legal right to claim the IP. She was counting down the hours until the afternoon closing, but she was unaware that the integrity of the shadow stitch had already triggered the professional inquiry that would precede any legal transfer. I prepared my final move. The public confrontation needed to be impactful, swift, and undeniable. I needed to ensure that every donor, every student, and every journalist present understood that the unveiling of the dress was also the unveiling of a profound family crime. The moment Zola's conversation with Dr. Vance reached its inevitable deadlock, I moved. I walked calmly toward the display area, my presence an unexpected silent disruption in the pre-exhibition chaos. Zola saw me first. The blood drained from her face, leaving her with the sickly, pale look of someone caught red-handed. Her eyes darted from me to Dr. Vance to the exit door. The confidence she had worn so smugly minutes earlier shattered completely. Malachi, who had been lingering nearby, noticed my approach and instantly rushed to intercept me, adopting his familiar, concerned frown. "Mom, what are you doing here? You should be resting. You know, the doctor said I cut him off." My voice steady and clear, loud enough to stop conversations nearby. "The doctor said nothing, Malachi, and I am here to fulfill my professional obligation." I turned my back on him, focusing entirely on Dr. Vance, who watched the exchange with professional detachment. "Dr. Vance," I stated, presenting my professional card, the one listing my full name. "Evelyn Theodora, Master Restorer. I believe the legal disclosure from my counsel has arrived. It will confirm that I am the sole practitioner of the shadow stitch and the only person who could have restored that antique gown." Zola finally erupted, her facade crumbling. "Theodora, you can't. This is professional interference. You signed a contract. You are incapacitated." She reverted to the exact language the recording had captured her scheming about. I merely smiled a cold, precise smile of absolute control. "The contract is unsigned, Zola, but more importantly, I have proof of your true motivations. Dr. Vance, the woman standing beside you has been recorded admitting that she intends to use the fraud of my incapacity to steal the intellectual property of the shadow stitch." The surrounding noise of the hall faded instantly. Every head turned. Zola tried to physically pull Dr. Vance away, but the curator stood firm, his hand already lifting his phone to confirm the arrival of my lawyer's document. The public accusation had been made based on the silent testimony of the hidden camera. The final scene unfolded with the brutal efficiency of an unwatched documentary. Dr. Vance, having quickly reviewed the initial documents from my lawyer, turned his full, frigid attention to Zola. His voice, though quiet, resonated with the authority of the academic world. "Ms. Zola," he stated, "the Foundation operates on integrity. The forensic evidence of the shadow stitch on this dress verifies the claims of Madame Theodora. Furthermore, we have received legal documentation that casts serious doubt on your asserted role in its recovery and the ethics of your firm's interest in Madame Theodora's intellectual property." The mention of the intellectual property was the fatal blow. It signaled that the Foundation understood the full scale of the planned theft. Moving beyond just the physical dress, Zola tried one last, desperate attempt at damage control, appealing to the surrounding crowd. "This is just a bitter old woman making false claims. She's trying to ruin my reputation. Am I Zola? I asked, my voice cutting through the noise. Or did the recording capture you telling Malachi to forget the rag and confirm that the shadow stitch was successful? Just minutes before you lied to Dr. Vance about the anonymous expert? The specificity of the recorded quote silenced her completely. Malachi, realizing the extent of the evidence and the public nature of the disaster, grabbed Zola's arm. "We're leaving now," he hissed, his face a mask of defeat and panic. They retreated, pushing their way through the shocked crowd, their high-stakes scheme collapsing around them. The matriarch had not only defeated the betrayal, she had publicly dismantled the deception using their own greedy words. The shadow stitch had proved the impossible, and the audio evidence, the hidden camera, had exposed the fraud to the world. The true value of the dress was now understood. It was not its price tag, but the proof of integrity it provided to one woman, and the damning evidence of greed it provided. Against two others, the sound of Malachi and Zola's panicked retreat from the university. Exhibition hall was the only applause I needed. It was the moment the public saw the truth, the polished veneer of their success shattered by the simple, undeniable integrity of a single restored dress and a damning audio recording. But the initial confrontation was only the prologue. The scandal, the inevitable, explosive fallout in the tight-knit world of art and finance was just beginning to detonate. I stood silently beside Dr. Vance, watching the media and donors scramble. The news was electric. A generational textile expert believed to be retired had publicly accused her own son and daughter-in-law of corporate fraud related to a multi-million-dollar/million-dollar antique artifact. This wasn't just family drama. It was a high-profile cautionary tale about greed attempting to corrupt history. Dr. Vance, his face grim but satisfied, turned to me. "Madame Theodora, your proof is irrefutable. The precision of the shadow stitch is beyond dispute. And the legal threat contained in your lawyer's disclosure makes this a matter of immediate public transparency. We cannot and will not allow this exhibition to proceed under a cloud of fraud." His words solidified the commitment of the Langston Dubois Foundation to my cause. They were not just fighting for me. They were fighting for the sanctity of their historical lineage, which Zola had tried to exploit. The art foundation, which Zola intended to impress and use, had become the executioner of her career. The news outlets, initially present to cover the exhibition's opening, now had a far more sensational story. The matriarch's quiet confrontation was about to become front-page news. The reputation Zola had spent years meticulously cultivating, the image of the sophisticated, successful liaison between finance and the arts, was now burning publicly. The scandal was particularly devastating because the deceit was so simple and so intimate. It was not a complex financial scheme hidden in offshore accounts. It was a brazen attempt to steal a mother's professional identity and legacy. The public, especially the affluent Tier 1 audience, recoiled, not just at the fraud, but at the sheer familial cruelty. The fallout was immediate and systemic. Within hours of the confrontation, the Langston Dubois Foundation issued a sharply worded press release. It confirmed that the antique wedding dress was restored to flawless condition by Master Evelyn Theodora, the sole living practitioner of the shadow stitch, and denounced any attempt to claim credit for the work as a malicious act of professional fraud. This press release was a declaration of war from a highly respected institution. It not only validated my existence and my skill, but directly discredited Zola and Malachi. Their corporate careers relied heavily on trust and reputation, assets that were now completely vaporized by the Foundation's official statement. Malachi's brokerage firm, already under scrutiny for questionable practices, immediately went into damage control. His partners, unwilling to associate their brand with a public scandal involving theft and elderly exploitation, initiated an emergency meeting. The financial world is ruthless. Professional betrayal can be forgiven, but familial cruelty that becomes public news is toxic. Zola's collapse was even more spectacular. Her carefully curated image as a sophisticated art consultant was obliterated. She lost her board seat on the Alumni Foundation she so desperately wanted to leverage. The network of donors and clients she had meticulously built over years dissolved overnight. They didn't want the risk. They didn't want the association. Her deception, meant to elevate her, had achieved the complete opposite. It had rendered her professionally untouchable. The narrative that captured the media was simple and powerful. The Matriarch fights back. It was a story of David versus Goliath, where the old, burdensome artisan used her unparalleled skill and moral clarity to defeat the greedy, corporate young generation. I learned later that the realtor, who had waited impatiently at the studio that morning, immediately withdrew from the property listing, citing ethical conflicts. The studio, which they had tried to liquidate as a burdensome asset, was now suddenly perceived as a protected historical landmark. Its value exponentially increased due to its association with a newly rediscovered priceless skill. The most devastating consequence of the scandal unfolded not in the headlines, but in the silence of their professional lives. Malachi faced internal investigations at his firm regarding the use of corporate resources to facilitate his private real estate scheme. His attempt to secure the intellectual property records through the hidden clause now looked like blatant corporate espionage, disguised as filial assistance. The voice recording, I provided to my lawyer the audio where they casually planned the fraud and expressed zero remorse, was a final crushing blow. It eliminated any possibility of them claiming ignorance, stress, or a momentary lapse in judgment. It provided irrefutable proof of cold, calculated intent. I watched a televised report where a legal analyst discussed the case. He noted that the hidden contract clause, combined with the audio recording, elevated the situation from simple property dispute to attempted larceny of intellectual property, a far more serious charge, especially in the art world. The analyst concluded that the careers of both Malachi and Zola were effectively extinguished. The reputations they had spent decades building had been vaporized by a single hour of exposure. The financial consequences were immediate. Their creditors, spooked by the public scandal and the sudden instability of Malachi's career, began calling in their higher-risk loans. The wealth they had so desperately sought to acquire through theft now evaporated as quickly as steam. My reaction to their downfall was not one of satisfaction, but of cold, quiet justice. I had not sought to ruin their lives. I had simply refused to allow them to ruin mine. The collapse of their reputations was a consequence of their own moral failure, not my vengeance. The Matriarch's determination had merely held the mirror up to their actions, and the reflection was devastating. I understood then that my greatest strength had always been my capacity for patience and precision. They measured success in quarters. I measured it in centuries. And in the long view of history, the quick money always loses to the permanent value of integrity and skill. The scandal served a greater purpose beyond the defeat of my children. It brought the immense hidden value of the shadow stitch into the global spotlight. Curators, historians, and wealthy collectors who deal in irreplaceable artifacts immediately recognized the significance of the technique's reemergence. The golden needle. My studio was transformed overnight from a financial liability into a coveted historical site. I received numerous inquiries from museums and universities, not offering to buy the property, but offering to partner to fund the restoration of the building and establish the studio as a working masterclass academy dedicated to Dubois's lost techniques. This was the ultimate Soleil's poetic reversal. Malachi and Zola wanted to turn my legacy into cash. The scandal turned my studio into a protected institution. The value of the property was now inextricably linked to the value of the knowledge it housed, ensuring its survival for future generations of artisans. Amara, the young student who had initially brought the dress, was instantly elevated. She was publicly recognized by the Foundation for her integrity and her connection to the Matriarch. She received scholarship offers and unprecedented access to the exhibition. Her career saved and accelerated by the very crisis her dress had initiated. She was the innocent who benefited from the matriarch's justice. I, Evelyn, retreated back to the sanctuary of my studio, leaving my lawyer and the foundation to handle the legal cleanup. The house was finally quiet, but this time, the silence was one of victory and vindication, not despair. The scandal had burned away the toxic layer of manipulation that had surrounded me. My reputation, once under veiled attack by my own family's whispers of my senility, was now stronger than ever, certified by the highest professional standards in the world. I was no longer Theodora, the retiring mother. I was Evelyn, the matriarch, the master, and the protector of an invaluable legacy. The final consequences of the art world scandal were delivered not through legal action, but through the severing of the familial bond itself. Malachi and Zola, unable to face the public shame and the devastating professional and financial damage, cut all ties. They made no attempt to apologize, to reconcile, or even to plead for forgiveness. Their greed had been exposed, and they retreated into their own fractured world of ruin. The matriarch allowed the separation. The relationship had been irrevocably poisoned by their calculated betrayal. Justice had been served not by a punitive sentence, but by the natural, ruinous consequences of their own actions. I sat alone in the studio, the morning sun once again falling across my cutting table. There was no antique dress, no contract, no looming threat. There was only the quiet hum of the ancient sewing machine and the comforting scent of aged silk. The matriarch's will had prevailed. The scandal's primary lesson was this: reputation is the only asset that cannot be legally transferred or stolen. It can only be earned and preserved through integrity. They tried to buy my reputation through a fraudulent contract. They lost their own through a simple act of documented deceit. The matriarch had reclaimed her life, her legacy, and her identity. The studio was safe, the shadow stitch was secured, and the future was one of mentorship and creation, not liquidation and fear. I had fought fire with precision, and the only things that burned were the reputations of those who sought to destroy me. The stage was now perfectly set for the final reflection, the comparison between monetary value and the true, lasting value of self-fulfillment. I have proven that some battles are won not with angry confrontations, but with the quiet, undeniable perfection of one's craft. The matriarch's victory at the university was absolute. Malachi and Zola had fled, their reputations in ruins. The antique dress, restored by the shadow stitch, was safe. The silence that followed was immense. Yet it was a silence punctuated by the ringing of my telephone, not with threats, but with offers. The art world, having witnessed the spectacular collapse of the fraud, rushed in to claim the prize, the master. The opening hook to this final ethical confrontation was a single, discreet phone call received days after the scandal broke. The caller was a representative from a prestigious private museum known for its vast collection of historical textiles. Their offer was breathtaking, delivered with the hushed reverence appropriate for dealing with a true master. They weren't calling about the studio property. They were calling about the shadow stitch itself. They offered me a consulting retainer, a contract that promised security, prestige, and a seven-figure income that would have eclipsed the entire estimated value of my studio and everything Malachi had ever earned. The offer was a genuine, non-exploitative exchange of money for my unique, irreplaceable expertise. It was the antithesis of the toxic financial bargain my children had tried to force upon me. It was the ultimate temptation, the chance to finally achieve the material comfort and recognition that my long career had technically deserved. I could have settled the old family debts, provided for a luxurious retirement, and proved definitively to Malachi and Zola that my burden was actually a gold mine. I could have signed that contract and claimed my financial victory. But the matriarch had already won. The true victory wasn't financial. It was moral. As I listened to the polite, persuasive voice detailing the terms of the private security, the exclusive workshop, the generous annual salary, my gaze drifted to the ancient, comfortable tools in my studio. The worn handle of my favorite tailor's shears, the slight bend in the desk where I leaned for my most precise work. These objects, once viewed as clutter, were now imbued with the spiritual weight of my struggle. They were the physical evidence of my mastery. The money was dazzling, yes, but it was just money a quantity. The mastery was an identity and irreducible quality. And in that moment, I knew with the profound certainty of a woman who has nearly lost everything, that the greatest reward was not the transfer of wealth, but the retention of self. The decision to refuse the museum's lucrative offer was the final, devastating answer to the core philosophical question posed by my children's betrayal. Money versus mastery. MalachI and Zola operated under the modern delusion that every asset, including talent and time, must be liquid and tradable. They believed that once I had proved my skill was worth $1 million, I was obligated to sell that skill for $1 million. They measured value by the price listed on the market. The Matriarch measured value by the depth of the depth of the depth. Commitment. Accepting. The museum's high-figure contract would have placed me back into the transactional structure I had just fought so hard to escape. I would have traded one form of professional obligation, my independent craft, for another, the rigorous, deadline-driven demands of a corporate institution. My time, my formulas, and my very hands would have become assets owned by the museum. The price of that seven-figure comfort was the freedom to choose my own projects, my own pace, and my own apprentices. It was the price of the quiet solitude necessary to perform the shadow stitcha. Focus that could not be scheduled or monetized on a corporate calendar. I thought back to the all-night effort. The moment Amara's desperate plea for help superseded the need for sleep. That act was performed out of professional respect and artistic duty, not fiduciary contract. That was the purest form of mastery. I explained my reasoning to the museum representative politely, but firmly. My skill, sir, is not for sale. It is for preservation. If I accept your contract, I become a servant to the clock, and the shadow stitch requires a servant too. History. My autonomy, the freedom to choose which piece deserves my time, is worth more than any retainer you can offer. The representative, a true connoisseur, understood immediately. He recognized that the very reason my skill was worth millions was precisely because I valued it more than millions. My refusal was the ultimate, non-negotiable statement of professional integrity. The rejection of the $1 million offer was the final, most profound act of emotional detachment from Malachi and Zola's worldview. They had used financial pressure to coerce me. I was using financial rejection to affirm my freedom. This refusal was a victory against the tyranny of the quantifiable. They spent their lives proving their worth through bank balances. I proved mine through a stitch that could not be seen, measured, or appraised in a standard spreadsheet. The studio, which they dismissed as having negative cash flow, was now, by my own choice, operating entirely outside of their economic sphere. I realized that the true reward of the all-night repair was not the global recognition it brought, but the internal peace it secured. The matriarch had found her purpose again, and purpose, unlike profit, does not depreciate or require external validation. It simply is. My lawyer was initially stunned by my decision, urging me to reconsider the security the contract offered. But he eventually came to understand that my security was not in the bank, but in the possession of the shadow stitch itself. My skill was the collateral, and my integrity was the guarantee. The subsequent conversation I had with Dr. Vance of the Langston Dubois Foundation solidified my actual preferred path. Instead of selling my time, I agreed to an official partnership with the foundation. They would fund the complete historical restoration and modernization of the Golden Needle, turning it into a nonprofit masterclass and archival studio. In exchange, I would commit to teaching to apprentices and supervising the preservation of Dubois's most fragile remaining textiles. This agreement was not a contract of sale. It was a contract of preservation and legacy. I retained ownership of the studio and the intellectual property, gaining the financial stability to maintain my work without sacrificing my professional freedom. I was exchanging my time for the perpetuation of my art, an entirely different transaction from the one Malachi and Zola had envisioned. The partnership with the foundation was the Matriarch's crowning achievement, legal and professional framework that secured my studio's future against any future malicious claims. It solidified my authority and placed my legacy under the protection of a powerful, ethical institution. The contrast between the two scenarios was stark. Zola wanted me to sign a hidden contract clause that would legally transfer my life's knowledge to her shell company for the price of a building sale. The foundation offered a legitimate, substantial partnership that was built entirely upon the respect for my autonomy and the value of the shadow stitch. I thought about the money again, the $1 million retainer. I didn't need it. I already had everything that truly mattered: the quiet, essential work, the clean slate of my conscience, and the knowledge that my life, once considered a burdensome liability, was now viewed as a priceless treasure by those who understood true value. The rejection of the money also served as a final, definitive judgment on Malachi and Zola. Their motive was purely financial. My motive was purely artistic. By refusing the $1 million payoff, I was stating that the intrinsic value of my work, the act of creation and preservation itself, was always and would always be superior to the extrinsic value assigned by the market. This was the core lesson of the entire ordeal. Money can amplify life. Tea cannot define it. They allowed money to define their actions, leading them to betrayal and ruin. I refused to let money define mine, leading me to freedom and profound self-worth. The matriarch had fought back not with rage, but with uncompromising integrity. She had faced the highest financial temptation and walked away, proving that her sense of purpose was the one asset they could never touch, never steal, and never purchase. The final, essential victory was internal, the triumph of the soul over the spreadsheet. My decision to partner with the foundation, rather than sign an individual contract, cemented my commitment to the future of the craft. I chose to create a legacy rather than simply cash out on a career. I returned to the studio and began the process of documentation for the foundation archives, a peaceful, fulfilling task entirely different from the panicked inventory assessment Malachi and Zola had attempted. I carefully organized my journals, translating the coded entries related to the shadow stitch, ensuring the knowledge would be preserved for the apprentices I would soon mentor. The matriarch was at peace. My focus was now forward on teaching the next generation of artisans the quiet discipline of the shadow stitch. My success would be measured not by the money I made, but by the quality of the skill I passed on. My final thought on the matter of money versus mastery was a simple one. The $1 million they offered was a finite sum. The ability to perform the shadow stitch, the technique I had risked everything to reclaim, was an infinite source of value. It was the perpetual power to transform what is broken into what is perfect. The antique dress, having played its part, was now on permanent display, a symbol of resilience. The matriarch's will, the fierce, unyielding dedication to integrity and skill, had secured her sanctuary and her legacy. I had refused the highest possible financial reward because I already possessed the ultimate, priceless compensation, the unwavering knowledge that I was Evelyn Theodora, master restorer, and my life was not a burden, but a testament to the enduring power of creation. The studio no longer felt like a fortress under siege. It felt like a sanctuary renewed. The air was cleaner, the light brighter, and the shadows that had once hidden my fear were now merely the quiet backdrop to my purpose. The battle against betrayal was over, and the matriarch stood firm on the ground of her professional truth. This final chapter is not about what was lost, but what was reclaimed, a legacy resurrected not by money, but by moral clarity. My new beginning was marked by the presence of Amara, the young woman who had brought me the broken dress, now returned. not as a client, but as my first official apprentice under the new partnership with the Langston Dubois Foundation. She stood where Malachi and Zola had stood, but she carried respect. It's not avarice. The transition from solitary master to teacher was profound. For years, I had guarded the shadow stitch in isolation, fearing the wrong hands would exploit its power. Now, the victory over my children's greed had clarified my duty. The knowledge must be shared, carefully and ethically, to ensure its permanence. The legacy of Langston Dubois, passed to me as Theodora, now flowed through Evelyn, the matriarch. To the next generation, my first lesson to Amara was simple. You must first master patience before you touch the antique silk. Mastery is not speed. It is the refusal to compromise. This lesson was the foundation of my new life. The studio was transformed not through radical renovation, but through dedicated restoration, funded by the Foundation's endowment. The building, which Malachi deemed an outdated liability, was meticulously repaired, preserving its historical character while securing its structural future. It was a physical testament to the triumph of preservation over liquidation. The matriarch had done more than just save her home. She had founded a school of integrity. The Golden Needle was now a protected historical site and a working educational institution, the ultimate, irreversible defeat of my children's scheme. The act of teaching Amara became a source of deep fulfillment. I wasn't just passing on techniques. I was passing on the ethical framework of the true master restorer, the belief that the integrity of the material is paramount, and the pursuit of perfection is its own reward. We began with the archival work, sifting through the countless documents and fragile artifacts left behind by Langston Dubois. This quiet work was the foundation of the matriarch's lasting commitment to her mentor. It led me to discover one final, deeply personal secret that Dubois had kept, hidden within the lining of his oldest, most used measuring tape. It was a small, perfectly executed piece of textile, a single, flawless square of ancient linen that had been meticulously mended with a nearly invisible thread. On the back, in Dubois's precise, faded handwriting, was a single cryptic note: "My last shadow stitch." For the matriarch, this discovery was immensely moving. Dubois, anticipating his own end, had left me a final, private test, a reminder that the mastery was mine to own and perpetuate. It was the last stitch of her mentor, a symbolic completion of my apprenticeship, certified not by a degree, but by an invisible thread. This final relic became the spiritual centerpiece of the newly established Matriarch's archive within the studio. It was proof that the legacy was always about connection and trust, not about financial exchange. It was the antithesis of the toxic materialism that had driven Malachi and Zola. The studio was now safe, not because of a bank loan, but because of a shared commitment to an ethical, enduring craft. The matriarch was free from financial worry, free from familial coercion, and free to devote her remaining years to the joy of creation and the duty of mentorship. The matriarch's new beginning was defined by the rejection of the burden my children had tried to impose. The studio was no longer a cage of responsibility. It was a wellspring of creativity. The work was tireless, yes, but it was my work, chosen by my will, and performed for the purpose of preserving beauty and history. The irony was not lost on me. While Malachi and Zola's careers and reputations were still reeling from the public, scandala, ruin they had engineered through their greed, my life was flourishing. The matriarch's vengeance was complete, achieved through the simple, unwavering commitment to the principles they had mocked. I learned that Malachi was struggling to maintain his firm, his clients rapidly departing. Zola, unable to secure new employment in the tight-knit art consultancy world, had retreated into a shadow of her former self. Their collapse was not my focus, but it served as a permanent, external validation of the matriarch's choice. Integrity is the ultimate, non-depreciating asset. My time was now spent preparing the curriculum for the new masterclass, ensuring that the theoretical knowledge of the shadow stitch was balanced with the ethical necessity of its application. Amara proved to be an exceptional student, embodying the quiet respect and fierce dedication that the craft required. I realized that the true legacy was not the technique itself, but the discipline it required. The shadow stitch demanded perfect alignment of the fiber, the needle, and the mind. It demanded a commitment that transcended the chaos of the outside world. This discipline was the greatest gift Langston Dubois had given me, and it was the greatest gift I could pass on. The matriarch had reclaimed her legacy not by defeating her children in court, but by proving the enduring worth of her skill in the public arena. The studio was saved, the knowledge secured, and the future was one of purposeful creation, fulfilling the very life path my children had tried so desperately to liquidate. The new partnership with the foundation ensured that the Golden Needle would stand for generations. It was a perpetual challenge to the notion that all history must be surrendered to the highest bidder: the studio, the instruments, and the knowledge of the shadow. Stitch were now legally protected as an educational endowment permanently placed outside the financial grasp of the avaricious. The restoration of the studio was handled by a local historical preservation team, working under my meticulous supervision. The slightly warped floorboards were stabilized, the ancient glass was restored, but the character, the scent of oil and old silk was preserved. The studio remained a sanctuary of authenticity in an increasingly synthetic world. My life, once defined by the fear of loss, was now defined by the joy of giving. I had the financial security from the Foundation's endowment, the professional validation from Dr. Vance and the art world, and the profound emotional fulfillment of mentorship. I often held the tiny, mended square of linen, the last stitch of her mentor, in my hand. It was a tangible reminder that true legacy is completed in the quiet, perfect final acts. Dubois had passed the torch of mastery to me, not as a contract, but as a commitment to excellence. I now held that torch, ready to pass its light to Amara. The matriarch's triumph was entirely personal. She was no longer fighting for survival. She was living for purpose. She had navigated the profound betrayal of her family and emerged stronger, clearer, and more authoritative than ever before. Her new beginning was a testament to the power of self-worth, a unyielding belief that some things are non-negotiable, and that one's life's work is not a burden, but a sacred trust. The matriarch had reclaimed her will, and in doing so, she had secured the permanent future of the art she held dear.